Hello and welcome to lecture number 18 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. In this lecture, we'll take up the subject of the rise of the Roman Empire. Now, you may recall that at the end of the last lecture, when we talked about Roman government and institutions, I was suggesting that the emergence of the Roman Empire produced serious and finally fatal strains for the Roman Republic. So let's build that empire and see then what kinds of strains it might have created. First, let's just clear up a little bit of terminology. Empire in the Roman context can have two distinct meanings. Okay? On the one hand, it can mean the large congeries of territories that the Romans conquered and over which they exerted rule, physically, geographically, an empire. But when finally the Roman Republic collapsed into a military dictatorship, Rome had emperors. And then the word Roman Empire refers to a particular kind of political regime. Now, that regime still had an empire as a geographical entity, all right? In today's lecture, in this lecture, what we're going to talk about is the building of a geographical empire by the Roman Republic. In later lectures, we'll collapse that republic into a military dictatorship, we'll create emperors, and then we'll study the empire that the emperors ruled. So today, empire doesn't have anything to do with emperors, it has to do with an empire. Okay. What then did the Romans do? How did the Romans come to build an empire all over the Mediterranean world? You'll perhaps recall that when we talked about the rise of Rome a couple of lectures back, it was the case that the early Romans around the city of Rome on the plain of Latium began to struggle with other parties in Italy. They struggled with Greeks to the south. They struggled with the Etruscans to the north. They struggled with various peoples who lived in their own immediate neighborhood in central Italy. And we saw that those struggles, which they had with their neighbors in Italy, had some fairly decisive, fairly important consequences for the early shaping of the Roman political system and the Roman social system. Now, gradually, the Romans sort of achieved a degree of independence from the Etruscans to the north. The Greeks continued to live to the south. And in central Italy, the Romans built what we call the Latin League. And it was Rome's relations with the Latin League that set the Romans on a course of conquest in Italy, which would eventually bring them to a course of conquest throughout the Hellenistic world, throughout the Mediterranean world. So Rome built this vast empire over a long time by small steps. That's the first thing we want to keep in mind. It was something that happened very gradually over a very long period of time. Now the Latins, the people who lived in Latium, rebelled against the Romans between 340 and 338 BC. The Romans successfully put down the revolt. Shortly before this war, the Romans made a treaty with the Samnites. Now, these were people who lived to the south of Rome. They lived in the hills to the south of Rome. And a border provocation then led to a series of 3 Samnite wars between 343 and 290 BC. As the Romans fought their neighbors to the south, the Samnites, they bumped up against the frontiers of Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, that area in the south of Italy, centered on the Bay of Naples, which had been all of those Greek colonies that we talked about in a much earlier lecture. Some of the Greeks had aided the Samnites. During Rome's struggle with the Samnites, some of the Greeks in the south thought, well, these Romans are a little meddlesome. They aided the Samnites in hopes of keeping the Romans to the north. The Romans therefore decided that that was a provocation and began to make war upon the Greeks to the south. The Greeks to the south then invited in one of the minor Hellenistic monarchs. His name was Pyrrhus. He was the king of Epirus, more or less what used to be Yugoslavia in the Western Balkans, to come in and help them. Now, Pyrrhus was sort of an up-to-date Hellenistic monarch, and he had a very substantial military establishment. He came in, he actually defeated the Romans twice, but both of his victories over the Romans were so costly to him in human and material terms that we give to those victories still the name a Pyrrhic victory, a victory, you know, that if you win any more like that, you're going to lose. And eventually, Pyrrhus was defeated because the Romans just wore him down. But once Pyrrhus was unable to protect the Greeks of the south against the Romans dominated the Greeks to the south. So we can say that by about 290 BC, Rome was dominant in the Italian peninsula. It is no coincidence that the Licinian Sextian laws granting virtual political equality in the Roman system passed in 287, very shortly after the end of these wars. The Roman military establishment, you see, had really depended on large numbers of people, and therefore it could no longer exclude them from participation in the political system. Now, these wars against the Samnites, against the Greeks of the south, and against Pyrrhus of Epirus are interesting and revealing to us for a couple of other important reasons. We see already then certain fundamental aspects of Roman military practice and tactics and of Roman diplomatic practice. So in this very earliest phase, we see some elements that are utterly characteristic of the Romans for a very long time into the future. Now, the early Romans, for example, appear to have borrowed the hoplite phalanx from the Greeks. That was the high-tech military establishment of the times, and so the Romans borrowed it. Now, that, we might just say parenthetically, demonstrates a constant theme of Roman history, a very pragmatic willingness to borrow whatever works. The Romans were quite willing to adapt, to adopt, to borrow, to steal ideas, notions, artistic motifs, poetic motifs, military practice, no matter what it was. The Romans would borrow. If it worked, they'd use it. All right. But when the Romans fought the Samnites, they faced a situation where the hoplite phalanx was just useless. The Samnite Hills, as any World War II veteran who fought his way up the Italian peninsula could tell you, are a series of very tough, hard, 2,000-meter high ridges, one after another. In those hills, the phalanx just wasn't useful. The phalanx is useful on a great open field. So the Romans began to evolve the legion, a series of military groups arrayed in something like checkerboard fashion on the battlefield. It's extremely flexible. It's extremely fast. It can move in one direction, move in another direction, apply pressure in one place, receive pressure in another place. The Romans basically learned how to build, to deploy, and to use the legion in the wars against the Samnites. And it was then with those legions that the Romans went off to conquer most of the then known world. Now, Roman diplomacy, pardon me, was the stuff of legend in antiquity, and it's been much studied and in certain respects much emulated ever since. Roman diplomacy rested on a few very basic principles. Some of these, it will occur to you as we go along, we've been hearing a lot about in very recent times. The first was the principle of just war. The Romans believed absolutely that the gods would not give Rome victory in a war of aggression. So the Romans always had to assure themselves that they were fighting to defend themselves, that they were avenging an attack against themselves, or, as the theory evolved, that they were forestalling an attack which they viewed as inevitable. All right? So the notion of a just war, justum bellum, the war must be just or the gods will not give victory. A second very important principle of Roman diplomacy was generosity toward the conquered. Beginning with the Latins in 338 BC, for example, Rome's conquered enemies, at least in Italy, were offered favorable peace terms and a form of Roman citizenship. So the Romans did not sort of put the boot heel on the necks of those whom they defeated. They defeated someone and treated them generously. A third key principle was the notion of divide and rule. Divide and rule. In other words, if you divide your enemies, you can rule them more easily. The Romans never made the exact same deal with any two people. Now, the very interesting element there, of course, is that no two potential foes had the same grievance. Rome's idea was that people couldn't gang up together against Rome because they would never have quite the same problems, quite the same grievances, quite the same difficulties. Roman diplomacy, as a further element of the divide and rule principle, operated on the principle that your friend is your neighbor but one. Your friend is your neighbor but one. Imagine a sequence A, B, C. I'm A. If I want to control B, I make an alliance with C. My friend is my neighbor but one. So the Romans were masters at spotting somebody who was difficult and making an alliance with that person's neighbor. A fourth element was sheer tenacity. Once embarked on a policy, Rome would not abandon it. Now, for these sturdy, staid people who believed in the customs of their ancestors and so on, that's not surprising. But Rome's enemies came to know that. The Romans were not going to give up. They were not going to get tired. They were not going to quit. They would persist. So, certain very basic military notions, borrow and use what works, be flexible, and certain fundamental diplomatic principles, already there in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. In conquering the Greeks of southern Italy, Rome came face to face with the Carthaginians. Now, the Carthaginians, remember, an old Phoenician colony on the coast of North Africa, very important commercial people, had a kind of a commercial empire, really, in the western Mediterranean basin, but they were also a fairly formidable military force. Well, the Carthaginians had lent some aid to Rome's enemies during the Pyrrhic Wars. Rome then regarded that as a provocation. Rome regarded that as an unwarranted interference in Rome's own internal business, and therefore fought a series of wars against the Carthaginians. We call these the Punic Wars. Remember, the Phoenicians are the Poini, the Purple people, or the Puni. So, of course, the winners always name the war after the losers. So the Romans called these the Punic Wars. Their wars, you see, not our wars, their wars. We fought wars against them. Well, they fought wars against the Carthaginians over more than a century. The first from 264 to 241 BC, the second from 218 to 201 BC, and the third from 149 until 146 BC. Now, Carthage was a very significant power. This was a big deal for the Romans to take on a power like Carthage. One by one, little by little, marching up and down the Italian peninsula, that was no small thing. But the Romans were now really taking on one of the important powers in the Mediterranean world. We may very well say that some conflict of interest was almost inevitable once Rome became dominant in Italy. The Carthaginians were the other great power in the Western Mediterranean. These guys were going to knock heads at some point. What was the exact trigger mechanism? Well, the idea that the Carthaginians had helped the Greeks during the Pyrrhic Wars in the 270s. Now, the Punic Wars are, of course, full of wonderful stories. Some of the most familiar stories from Roman history are wrapped up in these wars. You know, this is the one where in the beginning Rome had no navy. Very small commercial navy, but really no navy. And the sources tell us of Romans sitting on logs down on the beach practicing rowing while boats were being built, you see. So the Romans were learning how to row ships before they had any ships built. This is the war where we meet Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, who mounts an invasion of Italy in the Second Punic War by coming over the Alps. Rome had a navy by then. He couldn't sail freely across the sea. So he marches up through Spain, across southern France, down over the Alps and into Italy, and brings elephants with him. One must imagine what how elephants struck the population of Italy in the 3rd century BC. Faced with a large enemy, with a large army, and with a superb general against them, the Romans developed a new kind of military tactics. Fabius Cunctator, Fabius the delayer, the staller, fought and harassed the Carthaginians for several years. The Romans basically fought a guerrilla war. Instead of this time sending out their legions, which would almost certainly have been defeated by the superior Carthaginian forces, the Romans fought a guerrilla war. Finally, however, the Romans did sustain a tremendous defeat at Cannae in 216, probably the single worst military defeat the Romans ever suffered in 1,000 years of Roman history. And yet, the Romans rallied, rebuilt their military, and by the year 204, took the war to Africa, when Scipio Africanus invaded the Carthaginian territories, and finally, by 201, the Carthaginians had surrendered. The third of the Punic Wars was produced very largely by Cato the Elder. Cato the Elder had a habit of coming into the Roman Senate and holding a fresh fig and saying that this fig had just been plucked off a tree in North Africa. It reminds one of certain figures in American public institutions talking about Cuba. Anyway, he's talking about Carthage just across the sea and ended all of his speeches in the Senate. Remember what he was talking about? He ended his speeches, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And finally, Cato's perseverance paid off. The Romans did indeed invade North Africa, defeat the Carthaginians, and this time they destroyed their city and plowed their fields with salt. The idea being that no one would live there any longer. So the Carthage that rose again later, that's there now, is actually slightly displaced from where original Carthage had been. Why did the Romans win? Several reasons I think we can identify. Tenacity and determination. Now, these are hard to quantify, they're hard to measure, but they are certainly an important factor. You may have just noticed as I've been going along here, 3 wars against the Samnites, a series of wars against the Latins, a long war against Pyrrhus, 3 long wars against the Carthaginians. The Romans were nothing if not tenacious. The second place, I think, flexibility in military tactics. The Romans were not so sort of hard-headed. They may have been conservative, they may have been traditional, but they weren't so hard-headed that they couldn't adapt. They couldn't try new things. They couldn't work with things that, with new practices, new military strategies, new tactics that would work in particular circumstances, whether it's guerrilla warfare against Hannibal's troops in Italy or the elaboration of the legion in the Samnite Wars. It was very, very, very important, particularly during the Second Punic War when Hannibal had his army in Italy, that Rome's Italian allies did not fall away. Roman diplomacy had proved its value. Roman diplomacy had worked. Rome's generous treatment of those in Italy whom they had come to dominate led those people to see their long-term interests as better under Roman rule, under Roman influence, than perhaps under the influence of anyone else. Now, during the Second Punic War, the Antigonids. Now, do you remember when we talked about the Hellenistic world, and we said after the death of Alexander the Great, 3 of his great generals, Antigonus took the Balkans, Seleucus took Palestine and Syria and Mesopotamia, and Ptolemy took Egypt. So 3 of Alexander's great generals sort of carved up his empire. All right? We're going to bump into those 3 families, not Alexander's immediate successors, but those who came after them here in just the next few minutes. But beginning with the Antigonids in the Balkans. The Antigonids may have lent some aid to Pyrrhus. That's not clear. It is clear, however, that they lent some aid to Hannibal. Once again, the Romans regarded that as a direct affront. This was an attack upon them as far as the Romans were concerned, and consequently, once they had finished with the Second Punic War, after 201 BC, when Scipio Africanus had defeated the Carthaginians, the end of the Second Punic War, the Romans initiated a series of 3 wars in the Balkans. These wars, 199 to 197 BC. Remember, they defeated the Carthaginians in 201. 199, they're in the Balkans right away. They don't let the issue rest. 171 to 67, a second war. 150 to 146, a third war. You may remember that 149 to 46, the Romans are defeating the Carthaginians for the third and final time. 150 to 46, they're fighting in the Balkans. You notice the Romans are now able to fight in 2 places at once. Now, the point is, of course, that they originally went into the Balkans to, from their point of view, even the score against the Macedonians for having had the temerity, you see, to help the Carthaginians. Yes, the Carthaginians. The Antagonists were defeated fairly promptly, but getting all of my people confused. The Antagonids had received a good deal of assistance from a number of cities and leagues in Greece. The Romans, therefore, regarded that as an affront, that Greek cities had helped their enemy, King Philip V of Macedon. Consequently, a series of wars were fought, the second and third of these Macedonian wars, to defeat, to defeat these various Greek cities and their allies. So by 146, Rome had come to dominate the Balkan Peninsula. During the course of the war with Philip V of Macedon, the Antigonid ruler of the Balkans, the Seleucids from the eastern Mediterranean had lent some assistance. The Romans then regarded that as an affront. Now, the Romans began as early as 188, 187 BC to reckon accounts with Antiochus III, the Seleucid ruler at that time. They swept his forces basically off the eastern Mediterranean. They put an end to his naval power. They seized a certain number of naval bases from him. They did not yet at that moment actually penetrate inland and conquer the Seleucid realms, but they basically defanged and neutralized the Seleucid rulers. Much the same is true of the Ptolemies in Egypt, who had lent some assistance to the Seleucids, you see, when the Romans attacked them. So once again, the Romans regarded that as an affront. Now, the Romans, again, largely neutralized the Ptolemies, but did not yet actually take over the land of Egypt. Though it's pretty clear that Rome was meddling in the internal affairs of both the Seleucid realm and of Ptolemaic Egypt. All right? So a substantial part of the Balkans had actually been annexed and taken over by the Romans. The Romans had not yet taken Palestine and Syria in the east, and they had not yet taken Egypt, but they had largely neutralized the rulers of those areas. Okay. After the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, Rome annexed Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, the first three provinces of the Roman Empire, the first territory outside Italy governed by the Romans. By 146, Rome had annexed Greece and Carthage, a strip of territory across the North African coast, and a substantial part of the Balkan Peninsula. Rome is now moving far outside the realm of Italy. In other words, at the end of the First Punic War, we could say the annexation of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica made a certain kind of sense. They're very close to Italy. The Romans could view them as representing security interests, security needs. There's a certain logic to that. They defeated the Carthaginians, but now you'll see a difference in Roman policy. In Italy, remember the policy of generosity. Treat your defeated foe well, and your defeated foe just might turn into your friend. In North Africa, they fought 3 great wars against the Carthaginians and then destroyed them utterly. They basically put sort of the Carthaginians into the dustbin of history. This time, no fooling around. The Romans went into the Balkans and fought again 3 times, feeling themselves drawn forward on each occasion, you see, to fight one party after another who had lent aid to Rome's foes. Again, not the old policy of generosity, not the old policy of make your enemy into your friend, but now take over, carve up the Balkan Peninsula, make it provinces of an empire, and place those provinces under the administration of Roman officials. But the Romans were canny. The Romans were wise. They were prescient. The Seleucids had lent aid to the Antigonids. The Ptolemies lent aid to the Seleucids. The Romans knew that. The Romans were affronted by it. The Romans could accommodate that to their notion of defensive war, of just war. But the Romans also knew that at that time they lacked the means fully to conquer the Seleucid realms or the Ptolemaic realms. So they didn't get themselves mixed up in a battle they simply couldn't win. They waited. Within a century or two, as we'll see in a later lecture, the Romans were able to take over those territories. But for now, they held. So there's a kind of a wisdom in the Romans. We may think them a bit brash. We may think them a bit proud. We may think them a bit ambitious, and they were all those things. But they weren't crazy. They had a very measured sense of how to move forward. In 133 BC, King Attalus III of Pergamum. Pergamum is a state in the northern area of what we would now call Turkey, Anatolia in antiquity. It was one of the smaller Hellenistic states that emerged. Remember, we talked about this when we talked about the Hellenistic world, that you had the great states of the Antigonids, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, and then a number of other small states emerged around the periphery of those large ones. We've met another of these today in Pyrrhus's Epirus, and perhaps we could actually say that the Carthaginians figure as another of these Hellenistic powers, although certainly the Carthaginians were there long before the Hellenistic world. Anyway, so King Attalus of Pergamum, a man who is influential in his own neck of the woods, a man who is fantastically wealthy, his spectacular architectural achievements were in part dismantled and carried off to Berlin, where one can go and see them today. So if anyone is ever visiting there, this is really quite a wonderful thing to see, and one gets a sense of the scale of a man like Attalus and of how powerful and important he actually was. He had no heirs. So as he's coming towards the end of his life, it's an interesting and open question. What will he do? He willed his kingdom to Rome. He willed his kingdom to Rome. Now, we'll have occasion to see a couple of lectures down the road that the Romans actually had a very considerable debate about whether to accept this legacy or not. There were some very interesting complicating factors in whether or not the legacy was a good one. For the moment, what I want to draw your attention to is the very fact that an important, wealthy, powerful Hellenistic ruler, by 133 BC, could see into the future. And he knew that that future was all Roman. And he wills his kingdom to Rome. In a very real sense, the year 133 marks a symbolic moment in Roman history. Rome has achieved dominance, utter and complete dominance. They haven't yet taken over every square inch of territory, but they have achieved utter dominance in the Mediterranean world, in the ancient world, in the world of all those peoples about whom we've been speaking over the last 17 lectures. But for present purposes, I want to draw your attention back from that world that Rome conquered to the city that did the conquering. Because in spite of itself, building this vast empire cost the Romans a very great deal. Now we're going to turn in a couple of future lectures, in the very next one, for example, to Roman culture, and then we'll actually destroy the Roman Republic. We've built it, we'll destroy it. Right now I want to just conclude this lecture by putting a little focus on the ways in which the creation of this empire generated unforeseen tensions for the Romans. First of all, for example, the institutions of a city-state had to be adapted to govern foreign territories. Remember we were talking about the Roman Constitution? I mentioned a certain number of officers, generally 2 at the beginning, and then there would be more, and then more, and then more, and then more. And the Romans would begin to do things like have praetors and then pro-praetors, consuls and then proconsuls. In other words, if you're going to take over a substantial chunk of the world and govern it, you've got to put officers out there. You've got to put administrators out there. You have to have people out there to run that world for you. You multiply, therefore, the number of offices, you multiply the number of magistrates. Now, you'll remember, I hope that I mentioned that over the first 400 years of its history, in Rome's Republic, about 100 families monopolized political offices. One of the things we're going to see is that in about the last century, that changed dramatically. There were simply too many officers for a few families to control them all, and too many new men who weren't beholden to the old system. In other ways, we can say that the empire interfered with the Roman system because war provided opportunities for wealth, for prestige, well outside the traditional Roman social and political order. Great generals, great conquerors, great battles, you see, could be fought, and these could be translated into political capital back home, which didn't quite fit with the custom of our ancestors. It didn't quite fit with what our fathers would have done, because in many cases these were new men doing new things. Finally, the Romans had of themselves a very long-standing ideology of the citizen soldier, the farmer soldier. The farmer would lay down his tools, would go off and defend Rome, having defended Rome, would lay down his weapons and go back and take up his tools again. During the Samnite Wars to a degree, during the Pyrrhic Wars to a degree, but during the Punic Wars to a very large degree, Rome put large numbers of her men in the field year after year after year after year. This produced large numbers of veteran soldiers who had been away from their homes, away from their farms, away from their families for long periods of time. And when finally they left the ranks, they needed settlement, they needed land, they needed money, they needed support. And they became a large, a new, and a complicating force in Roman politics. Now, you'll perhaps remember that last time we talked about patron-client bonds. In the old days, those were sort of local big shots who loaned the local people little money, who took care of the local people's legal business and so on, and who could count on the local people to vote their way in the assemblies. Now the patron-client bonds in the last generations of the Roman Republic shift to the veteran soldiers of great generals. So great generals not only have wealth and power and prestige and so on gained from victories on far battlefields, they've got guys back home who'll vote the way they want them to. And that was something very new and different, and not at all the way our ancestors would do it. Well, we've talked then a little bit about the constitution of the Roman Republic, and we've talked a little bit about the building of a Roman Empire. Let's leave this sort of unrelieved picture of politics and war and diplomacy, and in our next lecture turn to Roman culture, for these Romans were indeed cultured people.